Hi everyone, my name is Ryan H. Lewis, and we survived AWS reInvent 2019. It was a whirlwind of a week. There were so many announcements, there was so much information coming out of Vegas. I wasn't even there, and I just felt the onslaught of new services, new features. There's just a lot of stuff coming out of reInvent, and even though I did daily recap videos every day last week, I wanted to come back and do a weekly recap, just a recap of the entire week, and I kind of wanted to break down what was announced. I don't want to go through everything that was announced. There were new features and new services for kind of everything that AWS does, but I wanted to focus on a few themes that, for me, were pretty apparent that came out of AWS. The first of those was serverless announcements, and I'm a huge fan of serverless. I have done it at pretty much every company I worked for since it came out. And there were some really great announcements that came out for serverless that I feel like completely changed the game for serverless architecture and Lambda specifically. The next theme that I want to talk about is AI on AWS. And AWS has been investing in AI for the last few years quite a bit. But I feel like they've really hit their stride this year, where they added a lot in terms of their AI services that you can use, but then they really invested in creating services that don't sell you AI, but use AI instead. So I want to talk about those as well as a theme. And then finally, I want to talk about infrastructure. AWS, obviously, there's a lot of software that goes on, but there's a lot of hardware, a lot of networking, their data centers, all sorts of things like that happen. And so every year they're going to have announcements from that. And so they had a lot of announcements this year in terms of new hardware they had, and also new ways that they are using their data centers. But first we're going to talk about serverless. So AWS Lambda is the function as a service that AWS has, and you're able to run arbitrary code on it. And there were really two major problems with it since it came out. The first is something called the cold start problem, where in the beginning of the Lambda function being invoked, AWS has to spin up an execution environment. So that involves taking your code, finding a place on a VM to put it, instantiating your code, which means if dependencies have to get run or anything like that, that has to happen, and then your code can run. Sometimes cold starts, I've seen them, I would say the average is around like 4 or 5 seconds, but I've seen some really bad cold starts that have been up to 10 seconds. So cold start is a huge problem. The second problem is in regards to database connections. So because Lambdas are creating new execution environments every time they're invoked, except for certain scenarios, they can't really keep long-running database connections. So that means that your Lambda, every time it's invoked, is going to basically need to get a new database connection. That's going to put a huge strain on your database, and it's also going to take a while. So those were the two major problems. Anytime I talked to somebody about serverless architecture, those were the two things that they asked me about. What about cold start? What about database connections? And there were kind of ways that you could get around them. Like you could get around the cold start problem by pinging your Lambda every 5 minutes to keep it in a warm execution environment. That's kind of a pain, and you're also having to pay the cost of invoking that Lambda. And then with the database connection issue, basically the best thing to do is to either use a service that has a REST API like DynamoDB, or create your own proxy to that database that you can call through with your Lambda function. So those were kind of the two mitigations for those problems. But in AWS reInvent 2019, AWS announced two new features that work with serverless architecture that are really designed to solve those problems, which is super exciting. The first is provision concurrency, which basically says that you can set provision concurrency on a Lambda function, and it will keep a certain number of execution environments ready to execute your Lambda, which means that cold start is no longer a problem. In some of the early preliminary tests that people have done, they found that setting provision concurrency actually removes cold start altogether. Your first invocation of your Lambda is as fast as your last invocation, which is really mind-boggling. Now, it does introduce a problem because Lambda and serverless is all about pay for what you use. It's all about having a dynamic environment when you want it and no environment when you don't want it. And so provision concurrency in a lot of ways is a compromise in that vision. However, in terms of adoption for serverless architecture and in terms of adoption for Lambda, it's a silver bullet. It solves people's biggest gripe, and I think it's really going to change the game, creating an even larger buzz around serverless and making adoption just go through the roof. So I'm really excited about that. In terms of the database problem, AWS introduced a new service called RDS Proxy, and RDS Proxy is designed specifically to be used with Lambda. It can be used with other things, but it's really designed to be used with Lambda. And essentially what it is it's a proxy that goes in between your Lambda function and your database, and it holds constant connections to your database that then your Lambda can use. Currently, they only support MySQL flavored SQL engines. You'll connect to your RDS proxy from your Lambda function, which has a constant connection to your database. So when you're connecting, you're not actually having to create a new connection to that database. There's a ready connection sitting there on that RDS proxy ready for you, which should completely solve the connection problem, which is amazing. I mean, one conference, both problems with serverless architecture solved. The next theme I want to talk about is AI on AWS. And while I'm not an AI practitioner, a lot of these announcements got me really excited. First of all, they announced SageMaker Studio. SageMaker is their service for training and developing and deploying AI models, machine learning models. And it's basically what you would use if you were going to do machine learning or deep learning or AI on AWS, you would use SageMaker. SageMaker has always, I felt like it's had a high barrier to entry. Like you have to already understand all the machine learning stuff, and then you can get into SageMaker. And so it's always, not that it's had a bad user experience, but it's had something that has made it difficult for me to get interested in it. This reInvent, they announced SageMaker Studio, which is basically an in-browser IDE for developing machine learning and deep learning models, which is awesome because you can learn how to do machine learning and deep learning development and do it directly in the cloud, which is so cool, directly in SageMaker. And so SageMaker Studio, it introduced that IDE experience. It also introduces ways to manage your models, ways to monitor them, debug them, and deploy them all within one service. And so this is really exciting. I haven't had a chance to check it out yet, but I can't wait. It's kind of the service for me to learn machine learning and deep learning on. But AWS also did something else with AI. Instead of selling services that allow customers to do AI, they started selling services that use AI machine learning to create some product. One of these services is Amazon Detective, which uses machine learning to analyze your logs from all of your different AWS resources and determine if there's been unauthorized access. It can then tell you what's going on, tell you where it happened, give you suggestions, things like that, which is really great. It's like having a AI detective looking over your shoulder and inspecting your account. So that's really exciting. There's also Amazon Fraud Detector, which is great for e-commerce. It's going to use machine learning and Amazon.com history and experience to analyze customers for fraud. So that's going to be really useful. Then we've got Amazon Code Guru, which actually does machine learning powered code reviews for your applications. It can connect to GitHub or Code Commit, which is really awesome. Right now, it only works for Java though. So if you're already working in Java, this is great news for you. Me, I work mostly in JavaScript, and so I've got to wait for the JavaScript edition to be released. What they do with that is they use machine learning to analyze a bunch of open source projects and then also Amazon projects to figure out best practices and things that will be bad for your code. And so then you can run it through Code Guru, and Code Guru will review your code and give you suggestions for that. So that's very exciting. And so all of these services, they use machine learning, but the product that they're selling is something different. It's not selling machine learning, it's selling a machine learning powered experience. So it's really exciting because there's a lot of things that machine learning can do. So it's going to be really exciting to see what they do next. And then finally, let's talk about infrastructure. First, there were some very interesting infrastructure announcements in terms of EC2 instance types that you can choose. One of these was Graviton2 powered EC2 instances. So the Graviton chip is an ARM architecture chip. It's not x86. So this is really interesting because ARM is traditionally used on mobile phones because it's really good at power management. So AWS producing Graviton powered EC2 instances is interesting and kind of game-changing because they're going to use so much less power, which means they're going to be so much cheaper. I've read somewhere that the power bill basically for data centers accounts for maybe like 40% of the cost. And so you can imagine that with ARM processors, it's going to be significantly cheaper. But also, if you think about the environmental impact of data centers and how many data centers there are all over the world, moving to an ARM architecture is just a great thing for the environment. AWS also announced the Inf1 EC2 type, which is using the Inferentia chip. This is going to be specific for AI stuff. And specifically, it's supposed to be really great for inferencing, which I don't really know what that means. But that's how they got the name. The other infrastructure announcement type thing that I wanted to talk about with AWS is how they are moving beyond the data center. And this is kind of a new movement. One of the things they announced is AWS Outposts. And Outposts are actually data centers that you can install in your room, probably not in your bedroom, but you can install in your office. And it's going to let you basically do AWS with a local on-premises data center. So this is really interesting because I feel like the trajectory of AWS has been from on-premises into the cloud. That's what most companies have done to get into AWS. But now AWS is kind of giving you an offering to get back into on-premises. So I feel like it's kind of interesting. It's kind of circling back in some ways. But the applications that they're really talking about are for manufacturing, for logistics, for research, where the companies that are using these AWS services, specifically with things like IoT, need really, really low latency. So if they're gathering IoT data from some manufacturing thing and something goes wrong, they need to turn the power off immediately. They need to stop it. And so if there's some latency in between the cloud and getting some result, that's not going to be great. So Outposts provide a way to mitigate that latency and make it so much quicker to kind of be able to process the IoT data that's coming in. Another one of the announcements that AWS did in terms of what's happening with data centers, not really the traditional model, is local zones. So local zones are basically data centers that are close to large geographic populations. Traditionally, Amazon will try to create their data centers, their availability zones and regions in kind of out of the way places like Oregon, or not to say Ohio is out of the way, but Ohio, Northern California, kind of places that aren't in crazy large population centers. A big reason is so that it's a lot cheaper to run those, but then they also look at places where there's not going to be a lot of environmental disasters that the data centers are going to be taken out by. So local zones are a little bit different because they're located in large geographic locations. Take, for instance, LA, which is one that was launched during reInvent. LA is a new local zone. You can deploy your applications to it. And then customers who use your product are going to get super low latency between the LA local zone and the customer. And so that's going to be really great for things like gaming, streaming, anything that needs a really fast ping rate. You're going to see people utilizing those local zones for things like that. And then the last place that AWS is getting out of the data center and moving into different things is AWS Wavelength. And Wavelength is basically AWS situating their hardware in the data centers of mobile carriers. So what that means is that when you interact with any application running on AWS with AWS Wavelength, your connection is actually going to be only on the mobile network. It won't actually go into the internet like it normally would. And so you're going to see much lower latency with that. It's also going to be more secure. So I kind of imagine that they're doing that for 5G, the 5G rollout. And so you're going to see that the performance and kind of the focus of AWS and moving into those data centers should have a big change. Now, right now, they've only announced 4 carriers that they're working with. The one in the US is Verizon. In Japan, it's KDDI. In UK, it's Vodafone. And in South Korea, it's SK Telecom. So if you're not a Verizon customer, you probably won't experience this. And I'm not even really sure what the downstream impact's going to be. Like, I don't know what applications are using this right now or really what it's going to look like in the future. But it should be really interesting. All of these things really show that AWS is looking beyond their own data centers and trying to figure out how they can expand in the world. And I think that's really cool. So that was reInvent 2019. Thanks for watching this video. I'm curious if you picked up anything else along the way. Was there any services or any announcements that you thought were interesting or game-changing? There's definitely Amazon Bracket, which I didn't mention, which is quantum computing, and there's plenty of others. I saw that there were 77 new announcements, which is just insane. Like, I can't make a video with all 77 even if I tried. At least one that would be interesting. Thanks again for watching. My name is Ryan H. Lewis. You can catch me at Ryan Murakami on Twitter or GitHub, and my website is ryanlewis.dev. Have a great day, and I'll see you next time.